There is a particular kind of silence that settles into a home by the sea. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of loneliness, something else entirely, the kind that arrives only after a long storm, after years of noise and waiting and wondering, and finally, decides to stay. I discovered that silence 3 months after I moved into this house. The beach house sits on the northern edge of a quiet California coastal town. Wide glass walls, polished marble floors that catch the morning light and hold it like something precious. A terrace that faces the ocean, where I take my coffee every morning without fail, watching the tide decide what to keep and what to let go. I was 61 years old when I moved here, and for the first time in longer than I could honestly remember, I felt like myself. That morning, I had been reading on the Italian leather sofa, something I had chosen slowly, deliberately, the way you choose things when you finally have the time and the means to care, when I heard the knock. It was soft, almost hesitant, like whoever was standing on the other side of that heavy oak door wasn't entirely sure they had the right to be there. I set my book down, walked to the door, and opened it. Two people stood on the porch, my daughter Caroline and her husband Stephen. I had not seen either of them in 12 years. I did not gasp. I did not reach for them. I simply stood there, one hand resting on the doorframe, and looked at them the way you look at something that surprises you without shocking you. Because some part of you, buried quietly beneath years of silence, always knew this moment would eventually come. Caroline had changed. Not in the way time changes most people. With a certain softness, a settled quality. She looked worn. Her dress was faded at the hem. Her shoes, once likely respectable, had cracked at the seams. Her hands, I noticed her hands first, were twisted together in front of her, fingers laced tight, the way a person holds themselves together when they're afraid of coming apart. Stephen stood slightly behind her, chin up, shoulders squared, the performance of confidence worn over something much more fragile. His eyes, and this I noticed almost immediately, did not stay on me. They moved, past my shoulder, into the house, across the room, measuring things, assessing. I recognized that look. I had seen it before, in a different life. Back when Stephen Turner first sat at my dinner table and smiled at me with a mouth full of charm and eyes full of calculation. "Mom," Caroline said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." Talk. That word. Carried across 12 years of silence, like a stone skipped across still water. I held the door open and stepped aside. "Come in," I said, calmly, evenly. Because I had learned in the years between then and now that calm is not the absence of feeling. It is the decision to let feeling exist without letting it take the wheel. There was a time when Caroline's voice was the sound I looked forward to most. Sunday mornings, her calling from college just to talk, about nothing important, about everything that mattered, the way she laughed at her own stories before she finished telling them, the way she said mom like it meant something solid, something she could lean against. That version of our relationship did not end dramatically. It did not shatter. It dissolved, slowly. The way morning frost disappears from a window. You never quite catch the moment it's gone. You simply look up one day and notice the glass is clear and cold. It began the year she married Stephen. I want to be precise about this, because imprecision is how revisionist history gets written. It was not that Stephen was cruel in obvious ways. He never raised his voice at me, never said anything I could point to directly and call unkind. He was, on the surface, exactly what a daughter's husband is supposed to be. Polite at the table, helpful with heavy bags, generous with compliments about my cooking. But there is a particular skill some people possess, the ability to close doors without ever appearing to touch them. Weekends that Caroline and I had quietly kept for years, a Saturday lunch, a Sunday phone call, began to fill with Stephen's plans. Work obligations that materialized at convenient moments. Social commitments that somehow always landed on the same days I had been penciled in. When I called, it was often Stephen who answered. Caroline would call back, he would tell me. She rarely did. I wasn't excluded with hostility. I was excluded with scheduling. And scheduling, I learned, is remarkably difficult to argue against. The invitations were the hardest part. Not the ones I didn't receive, though those hurt in ways I still find difficult to name. It was the explanations that followed, each one carefully worded, each one leaving just enough room for me to feel guilty for being hurt. Caroline's MBA graduation. "Mom, we thought you had other plans. We didn't want to bother you." I had no other plans. I had been waiting for the date for months. The baby shower, when their first child was on the way, it was just a small thing. A few friends from her program, very low-key. I found out later it was held at a rented venue with 40 guests and a catered lunch. I did not make a scene. I did not demand explanations. I nodded. I said I understood. I hung up the phone and sat with the specific, quiet ache of a person who is learning, slowly, that they have been reclassified in someone's life. Moved from essential to optional, from family to circumstance. Thanksgiving came and went. Christmas. My birthday in February, which Caroline had remembered without fail for the first 38 years of her life and then, apparently, forgot. I bought myself a small cake from the bakery on the corner, chocolate, because that was what I liked, and there was no longer anyone to redirect the choice. I set it on the kitchen table, pressed a single candle into the frosting, lit it, and sat alone in my apartment while the evening traffic moved outside my window. I did not cry that night. I had already done a great deal of crying by then, and I had come to understand that tears, however honest, do not change locked doors. What I did instead was bake. Not for comfort at first, for survival. My savings had thinned considerably over the years, and the rent on my apartment climbed with a reliability that my daughter's phone calls no longer shared. So I turned to the one skill I had always trusted, the one that had filled my kitchen with warmth long before loneliness moved in, and I began selling at the local farmer's market. Sundays, a folding table, pies wrapped in cellophane, cakes boxed in white cardboard, labels written in my own handwriting. Apple, peach, lemon chess, chocolate fudge. I was up before dawn every week, mixing and rolling and sliding pans into the oven while the rest of the street was still asleep. It was humbling, I won't pretend otherwise. Standing in the sun with flour-dusted aprons and aching shoulders while strangers decided whether my work was worth $7 felt in the beginning like a particular kind of defeat. But strangers, I discovered, are sometimes more generous than family. They came back. Week after week, they brought friends. They left notes tucked into the empty pie tins they returned. Best crust I've ever had, and my mother would have loved this. And please don't ever stop making the peach. They asked my name. They remembered it. They treated my work like it mattered, because to them, simply and honestly, it did. It was at that market where I met Helen Carter. She was in her mid-70s, white-haired, with the kind of posture that suggested she had once been told to stand up straight and had never stopped. She bought 3 pies every Sunday, 1 for herself, 2 for neighbors she described with the casual affection of someone who had decided, at some point, to build her own version of family from whoever happened to be nearby. Her children were grown, busy, distant in the way that has become so ordinary it barely warrants comment anymore. We never said this plainly to each other, not at first. We talked around it, the way you talk around a bruise, acknowledging the general area without pressing directly on the pain. But over time, over paper cups of bad coffee, and the particular honesty that comes from having little left to protect, we said the real things. Children think that once they have families of their own, parents stop needing anything, Helen said one morning, watching a young couple push a stroller past our table, and they remember we exist again the moment they need something. I didn't respond right away. I folded the corner of a napkin, watched the couple disappear around the corner. She's right, I thought, and I filed that thought somewhere careful, somewhere I would not lose it. The phone call came on a Tuesday. I remember the day specifically because I had just finished the last of the Monday apple pies, had set them on the cooling rack in a neat row the way I always did, and was washing flour from my hands when the phone rang. An unfamiliar number. California area code. I almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end was measured, formal. A lawyer named Gerald Whitmore, calling from a firm in Los Angeles. He asked if I was Marion Lockwood, née Whitmore. I told him I was. He paused for exactly the length of time a person pauses when they are about to deliver news they know will require a moment to land. My Aunt Agnes had passed away. Agnes Whitmore. I turned the name over in my mind the way you turn over an object found in an old drawer, familiar in shape, uncertain in meaning. She had left for California decades ago, long before I was old enough to understand what it meant for a woman to simply decide to go. There had been Christmas cards, occasional and brief, a photograph in sepia tones that lived in a shoebox in my mother's closet, stories told in the particular half-whisper adults use when they find someone's choices both admirable and slightly unsettling. Agnes had never married, never explained herself to anyone, as far as I could tell. She had simply gone west and built something, quietly, without announcement, and apparently never stopped. Mr. Whitmore explained the estate with the careful efficiency of someone who understood that large numbers require space to be absorbed. The Los Angeles property alone had sold for just over $1 million. The investment accounts, the savings, the additional holdings, altogether a figure that caused me to grip the edge of the counter with one still damp hand and say nothing for a long moment. She left it to me, not to distant cousins, not to institutions, to me. The niece she had followed, he explained, through letters and secondhand news and the quiet long-distance attention of someone who cared without requiring acknowledgement in return. She had left a letter. Mr. Whitmore read it to me over the phone, slowly, as if he understood it deserved that pace. Agnes's handwriting, he said, had been shaky near the end, but the words were precise. Marion, it began, I have watched you from further away than I would have liked. I have seen what you carried and how you carried it, without complaint, without collapse. You were never given what you deserved. I want the years you have left to feel like what they should have always been. She ended it simply. Live like the woman you are. not the one they tried to convince you to be. I set the phone down after we finished speaking, stood in my kitchen among the cooling pies. The late afternoon light came through the window at a low angle, catching the steam that still rose faintly from the crusts. I did not call anyone. There was no one at that particular moment who needed to know. I simply stood there, and for the first time in years, let myself feel something without immediately bracing against it. The months that followed moved with a deliberateness I had not previously been able to afford. I found the beach house through a realtor who showed me 7 properties before I walked into this one and felt the particular stillness of a place that had been waiting. Wide glass walls, morning light that arrived early and stayed late, the sound of the ocean not as background noise but as something constant and clarifying, a rhythm that asked nothing and offered everything. I furnished it slowly, not extravagantly, but intentionally. Each piece chosen because it was right, not because it was fast or cheap or the first available option. The Italian leather sofa in a shade of warm cream, bookshelves built into the wall that I filled, shelf by shelf, with books I had always meant to read. A kitchen, finally a real kitchen, where the counter space was generous and the light was good and I could bake at dawn without bumping into the limits of a small apartment. I walked the shoreline every evening. Sometimes I brought coffee. Sometimes just my hands in my pockets and the particular quality of attention that arrives when there is nothing urgent demanding it. The tide moved in and out with a patience I was still learning to match. Helen drove up from the valley once a month. We sat on the terrace and talked the way people talk when they have stopped performing and started simply being honest. She brought wine. I baked. We watched the sun drop behind the water, and neither of us rushed the silence when it arrived. This was my life. Quiet, earned, genuinely mine. And then, 3 months in, on an ordinary afternoon when the light was soft and the tide was low, I heard the knock at the door. I had imagined this moment before. Not obsessively. I was not a woman who rehearsed confrontations in bathroom mirrors or drafted speeches she would never deliver. But in the quieter hours, when the apartment had been too still and the birthday cake too small, the thought had occasionally surfaced. What would I say if they ever came back? And here is what I had learned about imagined conversations. They are always louder than the real ones. The real one was quiet, almost ordinary. The 3 of us sitting in a room with good furniture and ocean light, speaking in the measured tones of people who understand, on some level, that raising a voice changes nothing worth changing. I let them settle on the sofa, offered nothing. No coffee, no water, none of the small hospitalities that signal welcome. Not out of cruelty, out of honesty. They had not come for hospitality. Offering it would have been a kind of lie, and I had grown tired of comfortable lies. Stephen spoke first, he always had. "Marion," he said, that familiar slight mispronunciation of my name, Marion, not Marion, that he had never bothered to correct in 12 years. "We know it's been some time since we were all together. We wanted to—" 12 years, I said, not sharply, just accurately. Not some time, 12 years. He paused, recalibrated. "We know mistakes were made. Mistakes were made. The passive construction of a person unwilling to assign the mistake to themselves." I noted it without comment. Caroline had not yet spoken. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed somewhere slightly below my face, the way a person looks when they are ashamed, but not yet sure whether they are ashamed of what they did or simply ashamed of being caught in its consequences. "Mom," her voice broke on the single syllable. "I'm sorry, I should have called. I should have been better." I looked at her for a long moment, at the faded dress, at the cracked shoes, at the hands that had once been small enough to disappear inside mine and were now rough in the way that comes not from hard work chosen freely, but from hard circumstances arrived at unexpectedly. "Tell me why you're here, Caroline," I said, gently but plainly. "Not the version you rehearsed on the drive over, the real reason." The silence that followed was the most honest thing either of them had offered since walking through my door. Stephen filled it because Stephen always filled silences that weren't going his way. He leaned forward, clasped his hands, deployed the expression of a man attempting sincerity the way someone attempts a language they studied briefly and never quite mastered. "The children," he said. "Whatever happened between us as adults, the kids are innocent. They deserve to know their grandmother. Don't you think they've missed out on enough already?" And there it was. I had expected it. Helen had predicted it, almost word for word, over wine on this very terrace 3 weeks earlier. "If they come," she had said, "they'll lead with the grandchildren. It's the cleanest play. Hard to argue against without looking like the villain." I did not look like the villain. I simply looked at Stephen with the particular steadiness of a woman who has had 12 years to think clearly and no longer frightens easily. "Where were the children," I asked, "when they took their first steps?" He opened his mouth. "Where was I continued, "when they lost their first teeth? When they started school? When they had birthdays that I heard about secondhand, if at all?" I paused. "You had 12 years to decide they deserved a grandmother. You are raising that concern now, today, in this house, and you would like me to understand that as love. Caroline's sob was quiet but genuine. I believed the pain of it. What I was less certain about was whether the pain was for me or for the version of her life she had expected to be living by now. "I know," she whispered. "I know how it sounds." "Then you also know," I said, "that I cannot simply receive it as if the 12 years were a misunderstanding. They were a decision, made consistently, over a long time, by people who were capable of making a different one." Stephen's composure thinned visibly. I watched it happen. The slight tightening along his jaw, the way his eyes lost their practiced warmth and showed something harder and more impatient underneath. "We're here now," he said, and there was an edge in it. "We're trying. That should mean something." "It might," I said. "In time, but it doesn't erase what came before, and it doesn't explain what prompted the visit today. So I'll ask again, more directly this time." I looked at him steadily. "What do you need, Stephen?" The question landed the way a precise question lands when it has been carefully timed. Not as an accusation, but as an opening. One he could walk through honestly, or not at all. He chose not at all. Instead, he stood. The performance of patience had reached its limit. "This is pointless," he said, his voice rising past the register he'd been maintaining. "We came here to fix something, and you won't even— You're just sitting there, judging us, when we're the ones who made the effort to—" "Stephen!" Caroline's voice was barely audible. He stopped, looked at her. Something passed between them that I couldn't fully read. A long history compressed into a single glance. Then he straightened his collar, the same way he had on my porch an hour earlier, and said nothing more. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. I had felt it before. In the years of unanswered calls, of cooking for one, of sitting in a quiet apartment, wondering what version of myself had failed so completely that my own daughter had decided to stop returning. It is the exhaustion of caring deeply about something that no longer cares back, of keeping a door open, internally, long after the person on the other side has stopped knocking. Sitting across from Caroline and Stephen that afternoon, I felt something else entirely. Not exhaustion, not anger, not even grief, exactly. Clarity. The kind that arrives not in a single moment, but after a long accumulation of them. After enough time has passed and enough truth has been absorbed that you finally stop arguing with what is plainly in front of you. What was plainly in front of me, a woman I had loved completely, who had allowed herself to be slowly turned away from me, and who was now sitting in my living room with hollow eyes and worn shoes, not because she had found her way back to love, but because the life she had chosen in my absence had not delivered what it promised. And beside her, a man who had orchestrated that absence with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that control rarely requires volume. I did not say any of this aloud. Some truths are not for sharing. They are simply for knowing. Caroline spoke again before they left. Stephen had retreated into a stiff, offended silence, the silence of a man unaccustomed to rooms he cannot manage, and she took the space his withdrawal created. "I've been thinking about you," she said softly, "more than you'd probably believe. The kids— Emma drew a picture last month, a woman by the ocean. She'd never met you, but somehow—" She stopped herself, pressed her lips together. I waited. "I don't expect you to forgive me today," she continued. "I don't think I would, in your position. But I want you to know that I understand now what I let happen, what I allowed him to—" She glanced briefly toward Stephen, then back to me. "What I allowed." It was the most honest sentence she had spoken since arriving. I held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that you are not yet sure belongs to you. "Caroline," I said, and my voice was quieter than it had been all afternoon. "I believe that you mean that. Right now, in this room, I believe it is true." I paused. "What I don't yet know is whether it will still be true in 6 months, when things are difficult in a different way and the easier choice presents itself again." She nodded slowly. She did not argue. That too, I noted. Stephen moved toward the door without ceremony. The visit had not gone the way he had mapped it, and he was not the kind of man who lingered in rooms where his maps had failed him. Caroline followed, slower, as if each step required a separate decision. At the threshold, she turned back. For a moment, she simply looked at me, at the house, at the light, at the life assembled quietly behind me, and I watched something move across her face that I could not entirely name. Recognition, perhaps, or its more painful cousin, regret. She did not say anything more. She stepped outside. The heavy oak door closed behind her. I stood in the center of the living room for a long moment. The house was exactly as it had been that morning. The light, the marble, the sound of the ocean arriving in steady, unhurried intervals through the glass. Nothing had been disrupted, nothing rearranged. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of chilled white wine, carried it to the terrace, and sat in the chair that faces the water. The sun was beginning its descent, pulling the sky into shades of amber and rose that seemed, as they always did, slightly too beautiful to be entirely real. The tide was going out, the shore stretched empty in both directions. I thought about Agnes, about a woman who had left everything familiar behind and built a life on her own terms, quietly, without requiring anyone's permission or understanding, who had watched from a distance and said nothing until the moment her silence itself became a gift. I thought about Helen, who had said once over a half-empty bottle of Chardonnay on this very terrace, "The most powerful thing a woman our age can do is refuse to be desperate, just refuse it entirely." I thought about the farmer's market, the Sunday mornings, the apple pies cooling in rows, the strangers who became regulars, who became, in their quiet way, proof that I still mattered to someone. And I thought about Carolyn, about the girl who used to call on Sunday mornings just to talk, about the woman who had sat on my cream sofa an hour ago with cracked shoes and genuine tears and one sentence that had landed differently than all the others. I understand now what I allowed. I did not know what to do with that sentence yet. I was not sure it had earned a response, but I was also honest enough with myself to acknowledge that I had not thrown it away. I sipped my wine, watched the tide pull back from the shore, slow and certain, leaving the sand briefly dark before it dried. Some things I had learned take exactly as long as they take. 3 weeks after they left, a message arrived. Not a phone call, a text, short, unadorned, without the scaffolding of excuses or the performance of grand apology. I read it once standing in my kitchen, then carried my coffee to the terrace and read it again in the morning light. "Mom, I'm in therapy. I'm learning things about myself that I should have understood a long time ago. I know I don't deserve a second chance yet. I'm not asking for one today. I just wanted you to know that I'm working on becoming someone who does. I love you." I set the phone face down on the arm of the chair. The ocean moved the way it always does, without opinion, without urgency. A pelican crossed the low horizon in a long, unhurried glide. Somewhere down the shore, a dog was barking at the tide, which paid it no attention whatsoever. I did not reply. Not that morning, not that week. This was not cruelty. I want to be precise about that, because the line between withholding and punishing matters, and I had thought carefully about which side of it I was standing on. I was not punishing Caroline. I was simply not rushing. I had spent too many years accommodating other people's timelines, absorbing their urgency, softening my own needs to fit the shape of their convenience, and I had learned, slowly and at considerable cost, that my own pace was not something I owed anyone an apology for. She had said she was working on becoming someone who deserved a second chance. That work takes time. Real time. Not the polished, compressed version of growth that people perform when they need something, but the slower, less visible kind that happens in therapy rooms and quiet evenings and ordinary moments when the easier choice is available and the harder one is chosen anyway. I was willing to see if that was what this was. I was not willing to decide yet. Helen came up the following Wednesday, as she always did. She brought a bottle of Riesling and the particular energy of someone who has been waiting patiently to hear a story in full. I told her everything: the knock at the door, the worn shoes and the wandering eyes, Stephen's performance and its gradual unraveling, Caroline's final sentence at the threshold, the text 3 weeks later. Helen listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, with the occasional small nod that meant "I understand" rather than "I agree." When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. The sun was already low, the water catching it in long, shifting panels of gold. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Wait," I said. "Watch. See if the words become something." She nodded slowly. "And if they do?" I considered the question honestly. "Then I'll decide what I'm willing to build, on my terms, at my pace, with boundaries I name clearly and mean completely." Helen raised her glass slightly, not a toast exactly, more an acknowledgement. "And Stephen?" "Stephen," I said, "is Caroline's work to do, not mine." We sat with that for a while. The wine was good. The evening was warm. The tide came back in the way it always does. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, inevitably, reclaiming the shore 1 quiet inch at a time. I think often now about what the last 12 years were actually for. Not in the way of someone searching for silver linings in suffering. That particular habit has always struck me as a way of avoiding the honest acknowledgement that some things were simply hard and wrong and should not have happened. The years of silence were not a gift. The loneliness was not a lesson I needed. Caroline's absence was a loss, real and significant, and I do not intend to reframe it into something instructive simply because it eventually ended. But I do think about what I built inside of it. The farmer's market Sundays, the dawn baking, the particular discipline of finding worth in your own work when the people who should have reflected it back to you had gone quiet. Helen, and the honesty of her company. Agnes, who watched from a distance and chose, in the end, to make her watching count for something. The beach house, the morning light, the wine on the terrace, and the tide that asks nothing. I built a life that belongs entirely to me, not in spite of being left alone, but partly through the specific skills that aloneness required me to develop. Self-sufficiency, patience, the ability to sit with difficulty without immediately trying to fix it into something more comfortable. That life is not a consolation prize, it is the thing itself. If Caroline does the work, the real work, the slow, unglamorous kind, there may come a day when I open a door to her differently than I opened it 3 weeks ago. Not with suspicion, and not with the unguarded love of someone who has forgotten what happened, but with something more considered, something that has been thought through carefully and offered consciously. That is not forgiveness as surrender. It is forgiveness as choice, made freely on a timeline that belongs to me, toward a relationship rebuilt on terms I have named and she has genuinely accepted. That day may come. I do not know yet. What I know is this: I am not waiting for it. I am not organizing my peace around its possibility. I am living, fully, quietly, on a stretch of California coast where the mornings are unhurried and the evenings are long. And if that door opens again, it will open into a life already whole. Not one that needs rescuing, not one assembled around absence. A life that was built, carefully and with great intention, by a woman who finally understood that her own company was more than enough to begin with. The tide comes in, the tide goes out, and I am still here.